Hello, Sunday School teachers, preachers, and students. Happy New Year and welcome to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. In this first lesson of the new decade, Solomon finally has a place for the ark. Solomon summons the ark from Zion to the newly built temple in Jerusalem. Cherubim and the Shekinah glory of God are highlighted in the text as the nation of Israel participates in the dedication of the new temple. About 40 years earlier, King David dreamed of a great temple for God's permanent dwelling place. David had the dream, but his son Solomon would fulfill the dream. After worshiping at the non-permanent tabernacle for about 500 years, the elders, the heads of the tribes, and the leaders of the ancestral houses lead the procession and dedication of this magnificent new permanent temple. The tabernacle was the symbol of God's presence among the Hebrew people. Now that symbol would be the temple. This temple would become the national sanctuary. Some of the ideas surrounding this week's text include the terms Shekinah and cherubim. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for subscribing to this channel. I love to hear your thoughts on the lesson in the comments below. If you subscribe to this channel and click the notifications bell, you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. Plus, that lets YouTube know that you like this channel and they'll promote it more. And if you have Wi-Fi in your church Sunday school classroom, this channel is a good way to teach and discuss this week's lesson. I provide a concise overview of background, context, characters, themes, and topics that gets to the point, saves you time, and enhances your own teaching and study. If that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. The only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. And if you want to support this channel, I accept correspondence and gifts at 1590 Jonesboro Road Southeast, Box 150032, Atlanta, Georgia 30315. So with that said, welcome again to SundaySchoolPreacher.com, and let's go to work. As always, we begin with the background for today's text. In this week's lesson, we remain in the Old Testament, moving from 1 Chronicles to 1 Kings. In the same way that 1st and 2nd Chronicles were originally one book, 1st and 2nd Kings were originally one book also. The New Interpreter Study Bible explains, Chronicles, like Kings, were divided into two books when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek by the Septuagint. And we discussed the Septuagint a couple weeks ago. As I discussed last week, the book of Chronicles comprises 2 of the 12 books of history in the Old Testament. And just as in Chronicles, the books of Kings also comprise 2 of the 12 books of history in the Old Testament. The NISB explains how Kings covers almost 400 years of Israel's history, from the ascension of Solomon to the throne before the death of David to the fall of Jerusalem in 587 before Common Era. I also noted how the books of Samuel and Kings were sources that the chronicler used to write Chronicles. So in some ways, the chronicler retells the same stories as Samuel and Kings, but the chronicler is focused on different aspects of those stories. The chronicler retells these stories because he wants his listeners to know that this God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God of King David, and the God of King Solomon, is still their God, and that they are still God's people. The NISB notes Kings covers almost 400 years of Israel's history. To comprise this history, Kings uses several sources. Those sources include the book of the Acts of Solomon. You can check 1 Kings 11:41. The books of the Annals of the Kings of Israel, and it's mentioned 18 times, beginning in 1 Kings, the 14th chapter, verse 19, and the books of the Annals of the kings of Judah, mentioned 15 times, beginning in 1 Kings, the 14th chapter, verse 29. The NISB also explains other unnamed sources were also used, some of which provide information about the prophets Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, and other prophets. Those 400 years of history include familiar stories such as Solomon's wisdom as he deals with 2 women and a baby, how the united monarchy divided, Ahab and Jezebel, Elijah ascending to heaven, Elisha and the widow's oil, the fall of and the captivity of Judah, and many other familiar stories. The 8th chapter of 1 Kings deals with the dedication of the temple, Solomon's speech at the dedication, his prayer of dedication, his blessing of the assembly, and his sacrificial offerings. The focus of our lesson today tells the story of how the Ark of the Covenant was brought up from David's tent to the completed temple Solomon prepared. Some important words to consider from the text include Shekinah and cherubim. So our review of last week and how it connects to this week. In last week's lesson, the chronicler wrote about King David's prayer. As David sat before the Ark of the Covenant, he was probably in awe of what God was doing in his life. He was probably in awe of what it meant for God to establish an eternal dynasty that would bear his name. I mentioned how I had a picture in my mind of David entering the tent, sitting down and simply saying, God, you've been good to me. David went into the tent, sat down in front of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and he prayed his prayer. He began by thanking and praising God for the present. Then he looked back on what God had done and where God had brought him and the nation of Israel from. And then he closed his prayer by looking toward the future. I also mentioned that as this decade draws to a close, David's prayer is a good model for us. With the new decade on the horizon, entering the new decade in prayer should be a good way to get it started. Last week, David sat in the tent and prayed his prayer where the Ark of the Covenant was housed. This week, Solomon, David's son, brings that same Ark of the Covenant up from his father's tent to the magnificent temple he's built for the Ark. What David dreamed of doing, his son now does. Townsend and Boyd's commentary titled this week's lesson, A Place for the Ark. Standard Lesson commentary titles this week's lesson, Solomon Summons the Ark. The scripture text comes from 1 Kings, the 8th chapter, verses 1 through 13. I'll read that text for you now from the New Revised Standard Version. It begins with a section entitled, Dedication of the Temple. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the ancestral houses of the Israelites, before King Solomon in Jerusalem, to bring up the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. All the people of Israel assembled to King Solomon at the festival in the month Ethanim, which is the 7th month. And all the elders of Israel came, and the priests carried the ark. So they brought up the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The priests and the Levites brought them up. King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before them were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted or numbered. Then the priests brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, in the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark, so that the cherubim made a covering above the ark and its poles. The poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from outside. They are there to this day. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone that Moses had placed there in Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites when they came out of the land of Egypt. And when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. Then Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness. I have built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell in forever." So what takes place in this passage? The lesson opens at chapter 8, verse 1, with the word then. Then Solomon assembled the elders. In the verse immediately preceding the 8th chapter, the writer tells us in the 7th chapter, verse 51, "Thus all the work that King Solomon did on the house of the Lord was finished. Solomon brought in the things that his father David had dedicated, the silver, the gold, and the vessels, and stored them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel, the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the ancestral houses of the Israelites." It seems obvious to me that Solomon would call the leaders and the heads of Israel. That seems obvious to me. These elders, that doesn't seem quite so obvious. What's not so obvious is why would he also call the elders of Israel? These elders are senior citizens, not persons holding a religious office. And I think that's an important recognition. We would be wise to acknowledge the shoulders upon which we stand today. Solomon assembles these elders and leaders because this temple would become the national sanctuary. All the tribes contributed to building this great temple with all of its costly magnificence and grandeur. This was the national sanctuary, and it would replace the venerated holy tabernacle that the Israelites had used for hundreds of years. This tabernacle would replace the tent and become a permanent house for the symbolic presence of God. Verse 2 notes that all the people of Israel assembled to Solomon at the festival in the month Ethanim, which is the 7th month. Townsend commentary explains this festival. This festival was the Feast of Booths, or Tabernacles, and it was a week-long celebration remembering the journey from Egypt to a permanent home in Canaan. Westminster's Dictionary of Theological Terms explains that there are 3 Old Testament or Hebrew annual feasts. These are the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, or First Fruits, and the Feast of Booths, or Tabernacles. Verses 3 and 4 explain that the elders came and the priests carried the ark. Solomon remembered the lesson his father learned about who was permitted to carry the ark. The priests and the Levites brought up the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, and the holy vessels that were stored in the tent. It was the job of the Levites to handle the Ark of the Covenant and all the relics inside it. The pulpit commentary notes that the Ark of the Lord had been nearly 40 years in the tent that David prepared. So David may have dreamed the dream of providing a permanent house for the ark, but it would take nearly 40 years between David's preparation and Solomon's completion. Verse 5 leaves us with a picture of literally hundreds, if not thousands, of animals being sacrificed on the move from the tent to the temple. Perhaps Solomon sacrifices these animals in an attempt to please God, or perhaps it's an attempt to repent for the sins of the nation. We really don't know. I really don't know. In verse 6, the priests bring the ark of the Lord to its final resting place in the inner sanctuary of the house. This inner sanctuary is also called the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. The Ark of the Covenant rests beneath the wings of the cherubim. According to Westminster's Dictionary of Theological Terms, cherubim is a Hebrew term for supernatural beings associated with sacred contexts in the Bible. Check Genesis, the 3rd chapter, verse 24, Ezekiel 10, verse 3, and Hebrews 9, verse 5. I encourage you to check out this video, The Angels and Cherubim. It's a YouTube video created by the Bible Project. This video does an excellent job explaining what these supernatural creatures are. And much of what they talk about in the video relates to our lesson this week and in the past weeks. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. Verses 7 and 8 offer more detail about the construction and function of the cherubim. They spread their wings, covering the ark and its poles. Covering the ark prevents its open appearance and or provides shadow or darkness for the ark. Verse 9 tells us there was nothing in the ark except the tablets of stone Moses placed there on Mount Horeb. Hebrews, the 9th chapter, verses 1 through 5, adds additional items. Verse 9 said there was nothing in the ark except the tablets of stone that Moses placed there on Mount Horeb. Hebrews, the 9th chapter, verses 1 through 5 read, "Now even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly sanctuary. For a tent was constructed, the first one in which were the lampstand, the table, and the bread of the presence. This is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a tent called the Holy of Holies. In it stood the altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant, overlaid in all sides with gold, in which there was a golden urn holding the manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat." So there were other things added in Hebrews, the 9th chapter, verses 1 through 5. Verses 10 and 11 describe the Lord's presence when the priests come out of the Holy of Holies. At this point, the Lord has come into the temple, and the Lord's presence indicates God's acceptance of the temple as a permanent dwelling place in the same way God's presence was represented in the tabernacle. This filling of the temple with the glory of the Lord in a cloud is called God's Shekinah glory. In verses 12 and 13, King Solomon closes this lesson telling us the Lord has said he will dwell in thick darkness. I think this helps us understand that the presence of God is universal. Whether in light or darkness, God can be found and should be sought out. Solomon closes by acknowledging that he has built an exalted house for God to dwell in forever. So let's give the text some context. A new year, a new decade, and a new you. Many people bring in the new year with New Year's resolutions. Some people pledge to lose weight, get in shape, budget better, spend more time with loved ones, and a host of other meaningful and thoughtful desires. It's great when those resolutions are actually achieved. You can and should celebrate. King David dreamed of a permanent temple for the house of God. But it took about 40 years for that desire to come to reality. And even then, it wasn't David that completed it. Perhaps if our dreams and goals are large enough to require family or community or a community effort to achieve them, perhaps, we might make our world a better place. Key words, not necessarily in this text, but good for discussion. Shekinah and cherubim. Shekinah is a term that in the writings of the rabbis came to mean the presence of God. It occurs as a manifestation or revelation of God. Though not found in the Old Testament, the term may be used in reference to God's glory filling the temple. And cherubim is a Hebrew term for supernatural beings associated with sacred contexts in the Bible. And I've given you those references. But I do encourage you to check that video out created by the Bible Project. It really does help to understand what these supernatural beings are. Themes, topics, discussion, or sermon preparation ideas. One might be dedicated to you. A second might be a new place to meet God. Question you might ask your listeners. In the new year and new decade, are there new ways for you to dedicate yourself to God? Now for the preview of next week's lesson. Next week we continue in the same chapter and pick up where we left off. As we continue studying Unit 2's theme of dedicating the temple of God, we'll see what Solomon has to say as he addresses the assembly of Israel. The lesson for January 12th is focused on Solomon's speech as he and the nation continue dedicating the temple in Jerusalem. The lesson is titled, Solomon Speaks to the People, and Solomon's Speech. The text is taken from 1 Kings, the 8th chapter, verses 14 through 21. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I am Reverend Dexter Alexander, and you've been listening to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. If you want to support this channel, I accept correspondence and gifts at 1590 Jonesboro Road, Southeast, Box 150032, Atlanta, Georgia, 30315. Again, the only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. Please also click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. And if you don't mind, please share this site with other Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Thank you, and may God bless you real good.